Cities don't lie. They reflect their communities in a way or another. Hom's nickname before 2011 was the mother of the poor. It wasn't attractive to big investors or tourists. It didn't witness important events and rarely hosted VIP visits, but it was a poor resident-friendly city. You didn't need to be rich to live and enjoy life inside it. With few landmarks, thriving center, calm but vibrant neighborhoods, life in Homs was as simple and peaceful as could be. War had carved deep scars in the city. Healing process will take quite a long time. The city which was once the mother of the poor will proceed to be the mother of the poorest. Now the city will speak out again about its people. It will tell you that wealthy and skilled residents had left the site, while poor and low-income ones had to stay, and the poorest had to come back to reoccupy their partially destroyed buildings.
After we left our house, we heard that it was destroyed. So we left to my grandmother's house, then we left to my uncle's house, then we left to some long distance relatives. Then we went back to Homs, then we rented a house, then we had to leave for another house because of the bombing. So we changed 10 houses in 8 years. And in 2016, I think 20 people were living there. People were gathering themselves. The neighbors were talking that if we go all of us back at the same time, we would feel like home again. So they were encouraging each other to go back and encouraging the shops to open so they would feel that their life is back there. So it was slow, but eventually it happened. Even now, because half the city is closed, the areas, the roads, everything, it's completely new. Even me, I don't feel like this is the city that I used to live in. It's completely different. Even the people who are living there, it's very different. So I don't feel that this is the city which I grew in.
The reconstruction and approaches to reconstruction, again, this is a word that gets used a lot. But if you unpack it a little bit, what goes into the reconstruction? One thing that goes into it is rebuilding. Another thing that goes into it is just revisioning a society, both its past and its future. There's a recodification of values, of moral values, of what it's right or not right to do, what it's acceptable or is not acceptable. So there are a lot of re's that go into reconstruction. One of the re's is rewriting the past. And that's always a selective process. You see that in other reconstruction projects where there's a kind of à la carte choice. You're presented with a menu and which bits of the past you're going to echo in the styles that you choose to rebuild in, which bits of the past you're going to focus on reconstructing those sites as they were, and which ones you're going to say, oh, this is a great opportunity to modernize. But in so many of the reconstruction projects that you see today, especially those guided by the international community, there seems to be this kind of sense of ambition. I don't know if it's an ambition, but wanting to pretend that the war never happened, to go back to a pre-war stage as if the war hadn't happened at all. You can't do that. You can't just kind of lift up the rug and sweep all the mess of the war under it and cover it up and pretend it didn't happen. It doesn't go away. And the problem with that attitude towards reconstruction is that very often the reconstruction ends up happening actually on the basis of the divides created by the war.
It has to come from the people themselves. Whatever reconstruction plans come through, they have to reflect us as people, and they need to look like us, to look like our history. I don't think that bringing something completely new or completely modern is what we need. There might be some potential to improve some areas of infrastructure like electricity or water, but the appearance of the buildings need to reflect us and need to come from the people. And if I'd see, for example, a completely modern building in the center of Damascus, I think it would be like exile in your own city.
The difficult question about kind of post-conflict reconstruction is how to get inhabitants of the city involved in the reconstruction of the city. So my feeling is that there aren't many good examples of that kind of participatory planning. I think there's a very good reason for that, which is in the immediate post-conflict period, most people are concerned with return. And when they're concerned with return, they're concerned with quite basic practical questions. And actually the attempt to get participatory planning going is very difficult in that kind of immediate post-conflict period. It's often quite difficult to set up representative sampling from a diaspora community. I think the question about the urban environment and how do you recreate public spaces, for example, how do you recreate diverse spaces where different ways of life coexist? One of the things is that any type of urban reconstruction plan needs to ensure that parallel infrastructures for different communities are not emerging. They also need to do things like include plans for mobility around the urban environment, right? Because if you can't get around the urban environment, if there are destroyed streets or if roads are impassable, then there's no mobility around that space. And so people have got no incentive, they've got no possible way of moving from one part of the city to the other, and you won't get that kind of experience of diversity.
How do you even approach a project as giant as the reconstruction of the city that was completely destroyed? In terms of the core of the city, core of Warsaw, it was roughly 80% of the city that was razed to the ground. So it was really pretty much a desert landscape full of rubble. All the infrastructure was destroyed, all the buildings were destroyed. There was really nothing left in the city, to the extent that there was serious consideration of actually not rebuilding the city of Warsaw because it could be considered too challenging of a task. But then when the decision is made, it's been really a project that united all political fractions. In a way, the best way of healing was to sit on the desk and plan the city, try to create something new from the ashes, try to create some beacon of hope, some urban future. So very early in the process of reconstruction, the decision has been made to reconstruct the old town of Warsaw and the main historical axis called Nowy Świat, 18th century architecture, because it was perceived as very important for the identity of the city. Actually, behind those tourist facades, there's been housing. To recreate the city for memory, but for everyone, and to make it usable for everyone.
During war, always the water infrastructure suffers both directly and indirectly, I would say. And given that the government could not tackle these issues, the small contribution that our team did, and with the limited budget that we have, made all the difference to the people. So we managed to get safe drinking water to areas with only access to water through trucks. So that made the contribution benefiting the community in an enormous way.
Urban violence and conflict isn't only about the destruction of buildings and the built environment more broadly, but how the construction of the built environment, how roads, infrastructures, housing, offices can be very much part and parcel of the way conflict is undertaken and carried out. So, this is where the whole idea of peace and war, destruction, construction, destruction and reconstruction becomes far more entangled and complicated, in which these binaries of peace and war become really difficult to see. Because in the case of Lebanon, you really can see, if you trace back the reconstruction that was being planned and enacted during the war years, as well as, after official agreements and the halting of open conflict, that there is no clear divide between a period of destruction and then this reconstruction period. And then it makes sense actually as to why the reconstruction has been so controversial and caused so much trauma. And now, you go down to Soledad, and of course there's enormous political conflicts that are going on, but it is a dead area of the city.
After old homes was opened and after the destruction, people just wanted to go back, but a lot of their houses weren't ready to go back to because of water, electricity, a lot of issues, and some houses were half destroyed. So some people really wanted to come back and live, even if it's one room, they wanted to come back. And because it was all gray and a lot of destruction, some charity colored all of the walls. And they drew a lot of trees and a lot of green, red, pink colors were on all the walls because it was something beautiful in the middle of the gray. As for the heavily destroyed areas, they reconstructed some of the houses, but they couldn't, of course, reconstruct all of the areas. So if you want to go back to your house, you apply to be reconstructed, and only 1 or 2 rooms with the kitchen and bathroom would be rebuilt.
Hopes and expectations were far from reality in the case of rebuilding destroyed cities in Syria. For economic and political reasons, no donors, fundings, or big investors are available. In Homs and by time, and after years of painful waiting, rubbles were removed. With almost no money left, displaced Homsi families realized that they should do it alone. So under economic sanctions and with the minimum of skills, materials, funds, families who were in deep need to find permanent shelter started to restore any possible parts of their buildings. The city will tell you also about confused, exhausted, and sometimes corrupted administration with shortages in budget and employees. The city will reveal a big gap between rapid informal movements on site and super slow formal pre-planned projects with almost complete loss of mutual trust between two parts.
All reconstruction after a war has to deal with both the mundane, the everyday, and the extraordinary. It has to deal with rebuilding sewage and lighting and electricity and housing, and it has to deal with these big iconic heritage sites. So there's always both. I think the question is also where priorities lie. The international community, when it's involved in reconstruction projects, has a tendency to focus its attention on the big ones, on the symbolic sites, whether that is the Mostar Bridge or the Bamyan Buddhas. I think when the international community is involved in the reconstruction after a war, the community itself, that international community, they come with their set of values of what's important to rebuild when, of their set of priorities. But then if you ask the communities on the ground actually what their priorities are in terms of having things rebuilt and what can wait later, it's not necessarily those sites. So I think time is a crucial dimension here. The international community works within certain timeframes, funding timeframes, often 3 or 5 year ones, whereas getting over a war, if it ever actually people get over it, takes generations.
One of the things which was really important in the case of Bosnia was actually the question about residential housing. It wasn't possible for those displaced by conflict to return, and establishing the right of return was a very important step in reversing what ethnic nationalists had done during the war. So during the war, ethnic nationalists had tried to unmake these kind of plural towns and cities, tried to make them homogenous, tried to claim them for a particular ethnic identity, and they had displaced particular communities in doing so, and getting the displaced back was a way of reversing the gains of ethnic nationalism. But that required people to go in, assess the housing stock, understand how the housing stock was going to be repaired. And actually one of the interesting things about the kind of contentious politics after the end of the war is that the war doesn't stop in 1995. So there's a peace agreement signed and the military parties stop fighting. But actually we find cases around the right of return where, for example, houses are dynamited to stop refugees returning. So making sure that there is housing for returnees becomes a very kind of contentious kind of architectural question. And this isn't glamorous, it's not kind of cultural heritage, these are kind of very basic kind of dwellings. And so actually I think in that sense the people who got involved in making sure that there was housing for return, that was a very important part. And and lots of these people were kind of architects, urban planners, builders and developers.
People in Iraq, even if it's unsystematic and non-technical, but they know how to at least try to build something, or like they are interested in building. And you may find the job market for unskilled labor who deal with construction works is the most predominant market in Iraq. Maybe because we have lots of destruction in the past, so people are like, let's learn how to do it. Otherwise, nobody would pay us to do it. So let's learn to do it ourselves.
We should never forget that Reconstruction is deeply and centrally political, and that equally the way in which the built environment is thought of and framed is all equally deeply political. So the contractors that are employed to undertake the reconstruction should be not thought of as mere business entities. We need to think of these, and as they often are, connected to certain elements and political factions and warring factions, importantly, in conflict context. And equally then the designs that they're producing. So if there is a design of reconstruction that is wiping away anything that was there, I would argue we cannot call it a reconstruction, or we certainly shouldn't think about it as reconstruction as a post-conflict measure. This is reconstruction as violence. And we need to be attentive of these issues and expand and be more nuanced in the way in which we are thinking about what reconstruction is and what it constitutes.
When I see images of Syria and of the destroyed cities, it very much brings my memories of Warsaw history and brings back these questions that are now very relevant, but they are being asked in completely different contexts. Every time the reconstruction of the entire city is a project that is almost impossible. It's almost unapproachable. And yet we know from history that it is also possible. It's always a small miracle to bring the city back to life. There is a need of uniting a lot of voices, and that might be potentially very productive, but I can imagine it's also incredibly difficult, because in each project of reconstruction, there will be people who will be losing something and they will be unwilling to lose it. There will be people who will not like certain way of reconstruction. There will be political interest, there will be property interest. And in a way, I keep asking myself, and I keep observing what's happening with this question, how is it even possible to approach such a big scale and a complex project in a political reality that is so fragmented as it is today?
When I came back to Homs in 2018, I realized how lucky I was to live in the undamaged part of the city. But I had a hard time to cope with the new situation. Different neighbors, noisy and dirty streets, beggars are spread everywhere. People looked tired, pale, and unhappy. everything became 10 times more expensive than it was before, and now we are all poor. Under these circumstances, the city will create a new version of itself, a harsher one. It will repeat its old mistakes and lose the huge chance of positive change.